That is the worst comeback of all time. Like, hey man, you really screwed us when you decided to do that interview with Liberty Magazine. You know, maybe talk to me first before you decide to say that we're going to lose and that there's no hope and that Germany's going to take over. Maybe don't say that. You know, it kind of looks bad. And he's like, oh yeah, well, you know what? One time in a magazine, somebody called my wife that woman. So, there. It's like, all right, well, what's that got to do with the fact that you are a traitor on 1,000 different levels? Good morning, how are you? Happy Sunday. Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise. It's Sunday, so that means we are reviewing Traitor King. We have an awesome chapter today, but it's very long, so I'm going to try to get it all done in this hour. I don't know if it's going to end up being a part 1, part 2. Hopefully not. I would really like to just get it done, but so not a long intro today because we've got to go lickety-split through this. It's really good, and probably one of the reasons I really enjoyed this chapter is not quite as dense on some of the names and the political intrigue, which I'm going to be honest with you, I don't, like, I have to read really hard in order to be like, do I totally understand this? And anyway, so it's another reason why we only do one chapter of this week, because it's a good book written very well, but it's also much more difficult than, say, Worthy, which is just dribble and trash, so you can really speed through that. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. If you'll do me a huge favor, will you check your subscription? For whatever reason, I keep getting messages that people say they're being unsubscribed. And so if you would just do me a favor, make sure you're still subscribed. And then also, if you would just hit that bell for notification, send to a friend if you think this would be content they would enjoy. And as always, thank you for tuning in. You guys are what makes this all work. Okay, Traitor King, let's get started. This chapter is called Exiled. And it's all about when they first get to the Bahamas and their utter distaste for the assignment, and they make no bones about it. They are angry, they are mad, and so then they start making friends to help them stay connected to what once felt like power. So now they start making friends in the Bahamas that connect them back to Germany, to their German connections. And despite all the efforts of both the Americans and the British at this point, they cannot seem to cut his love affair off with one particular person who we've heard of before, but who makes a huge return in this chapter. He's a massive issue in this chapter. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. So we start off by saying, the royal couple, together with the Woods and Gray Phillips, arrived in Bermuda on August 9th, and they were met by a guard of honor and a band at the yacht club steps. They spent the next few days at the government house, swimming, shopping, playing golf, whilst they waited to pick up their connection to the Bahamas. Whilst there, the Duke was appalled to receive a telegram from Lord Lloyd, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, saying that the Duchess was not entitled to a curtsy and should be addressed as Your Grace. And he drafted a reply saying in that case he would not proceed to Nassau to take up his appointment, although eventually he was persuaded to just move along. It's unbelievable how petty he has to make everything. You know, of course, this has been a theme throughout the book, his utter petty approach to everything. But you will see in this chapter what a small man he was, as though we don't already know it, but it's just compounded once again. Anyway, in his angst and indignation that his wife should not be addressed by anything more important than Your Grace, and that she should not receive a curtsy, he hustles on over to send a telegraph to who do you think? Old dear Santos, back at his old stomping grounds. Can't let that connection to the Nazis die, not with his wife being called Your Grace at the new post. So he sends a telegram to Santo, and he says, it will be a great help if you're able to effect the transaction that you and I discussed in my cabin in the presence of Gray Phillips before the ship sailed. Always these shadowy references. I shall appreciate your notifying me one way or the other at your earliest convenience, as in the event of proving difficult to carry out the plan in the most advantageous way, I shall have to make other arrangements from this side. I mean, you know, one of the things that I have come to despise exceedingly is the roundabout way in which people make requests of each other. Now, I know it's customary, and I think that it's time and culture that makes so many of these telegrams so annoyingly vague. But what's interesting in this chapter is we do see juxtaposed against the way the British were communicating with each other at the time versus the way the Americans are communicating at the time. It's sort of a very interesting cultural dynamic in the sense that when you read intelligence from the Americans, they're very blunt. Like there's no pussyfooting around about what they think of Wallace, what she's been up to, and the damage that both she and David have caused collectively. Whereas with the British communication, it's all very like, nobody's going to point any real fingers, but if you could, maybe perhaps. I mean, the clearest we've ever gotten is from Churchill. Now, he doesn't mince words, but there's just so much like, I'm going to say this, but please read between the lines. Anyway, to continue. 5 days later, at the height of the Battle of Britain, when Britain was fighting for its very survival, the Duke sent another coded telegram to Santo, who reported it to the German ambassador. In turn, the ambassador sought instructions from Berlin. The confidant had just received a telegram from the Duke from Bermuda, asking him to send a communication as soon as action was advisable, should any answer be made. And if genuine, as it almost certainly was, this was communication with a known foreign agent during wartime, which meant that the Duke could have been prosecuted under the 1940 Treachery Act. And certainly he should have been. Here, Britain is clinging for life by a scrap. And he's over there telegramming, being like, hey, I just want to make sure that we're still good, okay? Can you just let me know? Because, I'm over here and it's very, very unfortunate and uncomfortable here. So I'm just going to want to make sure that everything's still good, okay? We're good, right? Let me know, please. Let me know. It's very hot here. Very hot. The accommodations are very lame. I'm gonna need to know there's an out. The royal couple arrived in the Bahamas on board of the Canadian cargo ship MV Lady on Saturday, August 17th. When they arrived, they inspected a guard of honor in 95-degree heat. The Duke was sweating profusely. And before he was sworn in by the Chief Justice and driven to the government house, where the Duchess gloomily inspected their new residence, the Duke played 9 holes of golf. These people, they are living in another world. Let's hear about their gloomy new residence. Now, there is one caveat where I'll be like, that was kind of unfortunate. But other than that, apparently their new home was a Spanish colonial house dating from 1801 of white stone with a tiled roof and large patios, and consisted of 7 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, and 24 other rooms. It sat in a 10-acre garden in the heart of Nassau, facing the water and surrounded by hedges of purple bougainvillea with rubber tree plants and an avenue of giant royal palms. It had only recently been renovated at a cost of $7,000, but the couple argued that it required rewiring and painting inside and out, and had patches of humidity and termite infestation. And Wallace described the dining room as looking like a ski hut in Norway. Completely unacceptable. Now, this is ridiculous. It had just been renovated, so what's the problem? However, I will say that this particular thing might have been an issue. There was no laundry room, and all the washing was carried out in a small stream in the garden and dried on rocks. So I think collectively we can agree that that is probably not what you would want, especially considering the sort of clothing she owned. No one's going to be washing those designer pieces in a creek, drying them on a rock. And I don't think that it was too much to say, hey, could we have a laundry room or some facilities to wash our clothes? That does not mean that our good things are being washed in a dirty creek and dried on an old rock. But within a week, the royal couple had moved out to a villa 3 miles outside Nassau, loaned to them by Frederick Sigrist, creator of the Hurricane fighter, who had just been appointed director of the British aircraft production in America. Now, of course, they want their home renovated, but of course not on their budget. No. Not initially. The first thing they tried to do was call back to home and be like, hey, could we have £5,000 because we need this place a little bit more livable. Consider what £5,000 was to war-torn Britain at this time. So he sends a wire right over and he's like, in order that the government house becomes a worthy residence for the king's representative in this colony, and to ensure some dignity during my term of office, I need £5,000. He continued that it would take at least 2 months to make it habitable. And as there can be no official entertaining during this period and the heat is now intense, I propose with your concurrence to take advantage of the hot weather season and go to my ranch in Canada. Did you not know when you guys set out for the Bahamas in August that it was going to be a little blistering. Apparently he didn't, and he's just shown up and he's like, whoa, the heat. Where's my ranch in Canada? Officials were appalled that Windsor wanted to leave the island as soon as he had arrived. And when resources were limited and he was only focused on his own comforts, Lord Lloyd responded that the request placed him in a rather embarrassing position. For example, may it not be said that if a sum of £5,000 could be spared from the crown funds, it might have been used to buy a fighter? Yeah, it's like, we're in the middle of a war. Our country is being bombed. We need all the resources we can get. No, I'm sorry, we don't have it to send you. You might have noticed we're a little busy. In response, they send out Monckton. Monckton's always the one who has to deal. Walter Monckton told the Duke that Churchill was very grieved to hear that you're entertaining such an idea, that is, to go to Canada, and hoped that given people were suffering rather greater hardships during the Blitz, that the new governor would be willing to put up with the discomfort and remain at your post until weather conditions made things less unpleasant. You have to speak to him like he's a child. He's just so self-involved that he would have to be told, hey, I know it's hard there because it's really hot. We had a whole section of town destroyed last night, and people were blown to smithereens, and their houses were destroyed, and their children are missing, and people are dying under piles of rubble. Do you mind if you just hold out? Maybe get a fan. The Nassau House of Assembly voted a sum of $8,000 for redecoration, but the final cost came to $20,000, which included building a new 3-story west wing so that the Duke's staff would have their own accommodations. Because there's not enough room in that, how many rooms were it? Like dozens and dozens of rooms in this house. But no, we got to build a whole new wing. The Windsors did pay for much of the internal renovation, redecorating the mansion in a modernistic style with occasional Regency touches, and Wallace furnished it with, her favorite staples: low glass-topped cocktail tables, open cupboards that displayed all her porcelain, and dotted the house with bamboo chairs. She just loved those 3 things. Oh, and mirrors too. She's real big on that. She filled the house with so many tropical flowers it seemed like a garden. And Wallace said that the reason she had to do this was, I must make it a home for him. That's why I'm doing this place over, so that we can live in it in comfort as a home. All his life he's traveled, and a palace to come back to is not always a home, so that's what I'm doing. Betty Homemaker. Oh, please. How is this house anything more than a palace? I mean, what exactly are the homey touches? The bamboo chairs and the glass-top tables? I mean, I'm sorry. Whatever Wallace wants to tell herself. It was not a good start, because the press caught on to what was going on, and they had many complaints that the couple were undignified and extravagant. For example, Wallace regularly flew in a hairdresser from Saks Fifth Avenue and flowers from Miami. Lord Lothian, the British ambassador in Washington, reported to Cadogan, it is most important from the point of view of opinion in this country to avoid the impression that the Duke of Windsor is not taking his duties in the Bahamas entirely seriously. Enclosing copies of correspondence and newspaper clippings, which should illustrate as clearly as anything what I mean. He added that if we are to maintain a full and due measure of American sympathy in the present ordeal, we must one and all give the impression that we are taking life with befitting seriousness. So their problem, obviously, was that England is in desperate need of assistance and help. They are being destroyed, and they are making the most beautiful stand against the enemy. But there's only so much that they can do. And the hope is that America will decide to join the fray. Now, their deep fear is that David will get his claws in, because of course David does not want peace made. He wants Britain bombed. He wants Britain at the end of its rope, so that his brother will abdicate so he can come back in under German authority. They cannot let David have even a minute with an American politician who has any kind of influence, because they need America's help, and they do not need America looking on at Britain and thinking, hey, you guys, who's this person of notable political value to you down in the Bahamas, just sort of partying it up, having flowers sent in from Miami. Like, she's down here acting like it's a tropical party. You guys are potentially sending funds down to fix their house. Like, how bad off are you guys? They need David with some measure of sobriety about the state of global affairs. instead of it's just one long entertaining party day in and day out. Wallace made no secret of her disgust at the posting, crossing out the government house heading on official stationery and replacing it with the word Elba. The place is too small for the Duke, and I do not mean that in any other way but that a man who has been Prince of Wales and King of England cannot be governor of a tiny place. It's not fair to the people here, or to him, quite honestly. The spotlight is on an island that cannot itself take it, and the appointment is doomed to fail for both concerned. In return, the locals nicknamed Government House, in honor of Wallace Windsor's past, the Red Light District. They didn't take well to her. There were numerous suspicions that the Windsors were not fully committed to their new posting. Gossip between some of her friends revealed that Wallace was an open admirer of the Germans. One friend wrote to the other, "We all know that she was a great friend of Ribbentrop when he was ambassador to England. She was even more stupidly outspoken against the British than he was, and they both also openly admit their tenure of Nassau will not be long. And they are furious to have been sent there at all." The British authorities remained nervous about the Windsors' proximity to America and the inspiration they might give to isolationists. According to reports from the United States of America, President Roosevelt will try to bring about peace negotiations between Great Britain and the Axis powers. The Duke of Windsor may also play a part in this attempt. He is known to have been convinced of the necessity for making peace when he was a liaison officer in France. There was just this deep-seated need to keep David away from President Roosevelt because David did want to make inroads into that relationship. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had his own concerns about the couple because he'd received FBI reports about them. Reports that stated things like, "It has been asserted for some time the British government has known that the Duchess of Windsor was exceedingly pro-German in her sympathies and connections, and there is strong reason to believe that this is the reason why she was considered so obnoxious to the British government that they refused to permit Edward to marry her and to maintain the throne." As a side note, I find that very interesting. Remember, the church got all the blame for why they would not allow David to marry Wallace Simpson. They said, well, according to the church, you can't marry a divorced woman, and so it cannot be done. But it would appear that it was more than that. According to the FBI reports, the reason that they put their foot down about it was less to do with the church and more to do with the fact that they did not care for her politics. The report went on to say that Wallace Simpson and the Duke of Windsor had both been told repeatedly to circumvent any kind of relationship or even the appearance of a relationship with German officials. But the Duke is in such a state of intoxication most of the time that he is virtually non-compos mentis. The Duchess has repeatedly ignored these warnings. Can you imagine? Like right there in the FBI report, it goes, well, he's drunk off his ass all the time. So, I mean, he cannot be trusted to do anything of any worth. He can't even think for himself. And she's over there continuing on her relationships and her conversations. I mean, this is just damning. The report goes on to say that prior to coming to the Bahamas, the Duchess had recently been in direct contact with von Ribbentrop and was maintaining constant contact and communication with him. The contacts of the Duchess of Windsor with von Ribbentrop from the villa which they were occupying became so frequent that it became necessary for the British government to compel them to move. So, according to the American intelligence, the main issue is Wallace Simpson. She is the problem predominantly because the Duke is drunk so often. She is the one running the show. Well, we got this from previous chapters too, when it was revealed that she was making plans to become Queen of England. And of course he wanted that for her, but he's really over there dilly-dallying and playing golf and doing all the fun things. And, you know, he likes to talk politics at dinner parties, but as far as who's making the concrete plans for the future, it would appear that Wallace Simpson is much more engaged with all those sorts of plans. Also, and this just blew my mind, Wallace Simpson sent her clothes to New York for dry cleaning. She's in the Bahamas. And this made the FBI suspect that the transferring of messages was happening through the clothes. Like the only reason anyone would possibly send their clothes all the way from the Bahamas up to New York City for dry cleaning would be because she had, you know, messages in the pockets of her dresses or, you know, things of that nature. You know, she's already getting her hairdresser to come down from Saks for Miami. Why is she having to send her clothes up to New York? Can she not just send them to Miami? I mean, first of all, is there not a dry cleaner on the island? And second of all, it would be wild if she was sending her dry cleaning to Miami, but all the way up to New York City? It's like, is she trolling them? Like, is she mocking them? That is the stupidest, craziest, wildest thing to do. Now, here we have the introduction of a main character in this chapter who we've actually met before, but who comes into great play in this chapter. Axel Wennergren. Axel Wennergren is exceedingly wealthy. He has his hands in 1,000 different pies. He's doing all sorts of things. And he is making business deals. He's running, like he is like he's like the elite of the elite. And he is the one who first gave the Duke these ideas about peace. He's the one who planted those seeds in the Duke's head right after the abdication. He sidled right up to the Duke and said, you know how you make your mark on the world again? You call for peace. You be the everyman's man. You tell the world about your hopes and dreams for utopia. See if they don't choose you. You know, plant those seeds of peace. And of course, as we've said many times, peace is only a word to make the ignorant come your way. One of the FBI concerns was that the Duchess would align herself with Axel Wennergren, and he had just moved to Nassau that year, and they were afraid that he had come with the sole purpose of cuddling up to the Windsors and continuing to cultivate that relationship. The British government was so concerned about this potential budding relationship that they had asked Lady Williams-Taylor to help on the social side of things and to keep the Windsors and the Wennergrens apart during social settings, and that perhaps she could, you know, create some entertainment and that sort of thing that would sort of separate the two of them and, you know, make sure that those two don't run in the same circles. How is she even going to possibly manage that? I mean, the constant toiling on the part of everybody trying to keep David away from his own worst instincts is ridiculous. Like, leave him to his own devices at this point. At the beginning of August, a letter sent to Axel Wennergren from Rio de Janeiro had been intercepted by the FBI. It mentioned the arrival of a, quote, new and interesting family with which I assume you will at once become friendly. I've met an old acquaintance who states that family holds sympathetic understanding for totalitarian ideas. This should be of great significance for forthcoming development of events. That's damning for both parties, both for Axel, who continued to tell everybody that he was just a businessman. I'm just making business deals. Whatever, she just get off my back. I've got no ties. I've got no allegiance. And then, of course, it's damning for the Duke as well, that anyone would think he had any sympathetic understanding for totalitarian ideas. So, I mean, just anybody who would want to paint a picture any different about Axel or any different about David is living in a world of fantasy, because these two were in league together with the Nazis, and that's that. That's all there is to it. There's no other way to paint this picture. There's no other way to assume. Both of these people were being set up by powers in Germany to cultivate a relationship for further development. That's all there is to it. Nobody will ever convince me otherwise. Wennergren had been pushing for a negotiated peace since meeting the Duke in 1937, which we recall. But in his time between 1937 and 1940, he had for 18 months been scuttling between Roosevelt, Goring, and Chamberlain, and he had tried to accompany the American Undersecretary of State, Sumner Welles, on his 1940 tour exploring peace feelers. Welles instinctively distrusted him, telling a colleague, I have not a shred of evidence, but I have a very strong feeling that this man acts as a spy for the German government. Well, he probably felt that way because the guy is entirely slimy, and all of his purposes, everything he seems to want, is what would favor the Germans exceedingly. So, you know, you don't need a smoking gun in this case. Everything he says is with hopes that Germany will overcome and overpower. Wennergren arrived in the Bahamas on October 17th from South America, and he wrote that he, on the very next day, had met with the Duke, and he found the Duke extremely pleasant and interesting. And he said that the Duke had a very good memory because he remembered all of the conversations they had in Paris regarding peace, you know. The very next day, he called the Duke to see if the Duke wanted to come over and see the projects he was working on at Hog Island. Wennergren and his wife dined with the Windsors at Government House. He wrote in his diary, pity that political considerations prevent closer social intercourse. Extremely interesting discussion. Well, it would appear that old Lady Williams-Taylor is falling down on the job, because these two couples are hanging out with each other constantly from this point on. Within a week, the Wennergrens were back at Government House for a party. It was the beginning of a close friendship with benefits for both parties. The Duke saw Wennergren as an ally for economic development of the island and an important employer, and someone in this backwater with whom he could discuss the state of the world. Wennergren was only too pleased to have this important contact. Now, the truth is, he was a big employer on the island. The book goes on to say that he had first come to the Bahamas in 1938 because he was attracted to the no income tax situation and because it was a useful base for his operations in North and South America. He had a 700-acre estate on Hog Island, which he had named Shangri-La, and he entertained such guests as Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich, and had created gardens modeled on those at Versailles. It was a beautiful place. In the spring and the summer of 1941, the Hog Island Project employed over 15% of Nassau's total workforce. So it was very easy for the Duke to hide behind the fact that this is just a businessman with whom he's making contacts to better the island. But the thing is that Wenegren wasn't just over there making a happy home for himself and employing people to do it for him. He had activities that were concerning. There were rumors that his role was to develop links with South America on the behalf of the Axis powers, in particular Mexico, which apart from its oil and mineral potential, had an important role if the United States on its border entered the war. And that Wenegren's new hurricane harbor was to provision German vessels. Now, the islands were taking on an important strategic significance to the U.S. destroyers, and in November 1940, there was worry that Wenegren, with all his aerial photography, was going to inhibit the ability for the American bases to be safe. So they decided that aerial photography was henceforth banned, specifically because Axel Wenegren was being so questionable in his procuring of photos of all of the islands. They didn't know to what purpose did he need all of that. Axel Wenegren has since November 1st, 1939, been constantly steaming in and out of Nassau Harbor on his yacht, equipped with high-powered radio antenna, noted Department of State official G.A. Gordon to the State Department. He said, "This yacht is manned by ex-Swedish Navy officers, all of whom, according to my informant, are definitely and professedly pro-Nazi." It was in this very yacht that the Windsors took a trip up to Miami, their first in years. The regular passenger boat that went from Nassau to Miami had canceled its sailing, so Wenegren said, "Take my yacht," and he offered to transport the couple when Wallace needed dental care for an infected tooth. They left on December 9th, almost exactly 4 years since the Duke had signed the instrument of abdication. Of course, they show up with their 27 pieces of luggage, because have you ever had a tooth fixed and didn't need your 27 pieces of luggage? They arrived to 12,000 people waiting for them at the quayside, and 8,000 people lining the streets to St. Francis Hospital. But Wenegren was not allowed off his boat. He was confined to the port as a suspected subversive, and the FBI were monitoring his movements. Before England and Germany became war enemies, this couple visited Hitler and are known to be Nazis' friends, ran an FBI report. More recently, in the Boston Transcript, its foreign correspondent, Leland Stowe, had a big story of their strong ties with von Ribbentrop and Hitler, especially Mrs. Simpson Windsor. The story goes on to say that it was becoming more and more alarming that the Duke was obviously such good friends with Wenegren, because behind closed doors, of course, we're continuing to have all of these agitators for quote-unquote peace. And this friendship was set against the backdrop of the constant peace moves of all of these various German agents who were, siding with all of these big global leaders, like trying to have meetings with all these people saying, "Come on, why don't you just give in? Just give in. Just let it be over, Cease fire. Cease fire." Throughout the autumn of 1940, Weissman had held a series of meetings with James Mooney, the head of General Motors overseas, to discuss brokering a negotiated peace with Germany. Also involved was the Archbishop of New York, Cardinal Francis Spellman. At the beginning of December, it had even been suggested that the Duke of Windsor be brought in under cover of playing golf at Cat Cay on January 6th. So it's all just a pit of snakes. All of these elite, greasing the wheels of the deals and having all of this very nefarious activity with people who are demonic. Why in the world would you be having any kind of conversations with the Nazis under any sort of circumstance, General Motors? And of course, there were many, many, many businessmen, American businessmen, who dealt with the Germans under the guise of, well, it doesn't really matter because we're not worried about politics. We're just worried about making, the next dollar. But the immoral stance of that is shocking. On December 12th, the British ambassador in Washington died as a Christian Scientist. Philip Lothian refused simple medical treatment that would have saved his life. And the Duke, who had been lobbying London and Washington to secede him, took the opportunity to hold a press conference, which only further irritated the British authorities. It's like, David, you are not invited to a seat at the political table. As king, you would not have had a seat at the political table. You don't get to poke your nose in anything, right? You're just supposed to be a symbol of national unity. So as ex-king, you have 10 times less of a right to speak about anything. So why don't you just sit down? Nobody needs to hear what your opinion is now that the British ambassador has passed away. It is not your time for a press conference, and it is not your time to tell us what you think of the whole thing and who you think should succeed him or any of that. You don't get a say. Could you just help the Bahamas? They're a poor country. Back on the island, the Windsors were able to move back into the refurbished government house. Since mid-October, they'd been living at the 20-room Westbourne owned by Sir Harry Oakes. Now, how they always fall backwards into the arms of these super wealthy friends who just seem to have multiple dwellings of grandeur that the Windsors can just sort of unpack all their many, many pieces of luggage into, it astounds me. I am blown away by how many times they're just squatting in somebody else's home when they have a perfectly good one just like 3 miles down the road, time and time again. It's always like, can you put us up, please? We really can't manage over there. And once again, it's all so they can make connections. These people's networking ability outstrips anything Harry and Meghan could have ever devised. This Sir Harry Oakes is described as a stocky and bluff man who had made a fortune from gold mines in Canada. And he'd arrived in the Bahamas in the early 1930s, attracted by the absence of income tax and a 2% inheritance tax. He owned the greatest property in New Providence, and it was estimated that he owned a third of the island. He had all sorts of political affiliations. He owned the Moorish pink stucco British Colonial Hotel, where almost all the employees were people of color, and he had paid for, amongst much else, the airport, a waterworks plant, and a botanical garden, and he had developed a bus line to bring workers from Grantstown, and he'd given over $1 million to local charities. So he was a very generous benefactor, which made him an important ally for the Duke. Now, a few days after returning from Miami, where Wallace was getting her tooth work done, the Duke met President Roosevelt. He met him in Bahamian waters on board the Tuscaloosa, inspecting potential naval bases in the Caribbean as part of the Lend-Lease Act, to discuss the bases and economic future of the islands and how the Civilian Conservation Corps and Unemployment Relief Program could be adopted for the Bahamas. It was to be the first of a dozen meetings between the two men during the war. But I would not say, at least from the vantage point we have, that Roosevelt was ever given the opportunity to cozy up to the Duke, because people kept him well informed about the scoundrel that he was dealing with. And one of the things that hurt the Duke the most was a 2-hour interview that he happened to give to the popular American magazine Liberty. The interview was conducted by Fulton Arsler, who was the editor of Liberty magazine. And at the closing of that interview, the Duke's ADC, Vivian Drury, asked Arsler to take a message back to the president, and it ran like this. Tell Mr. Roosevelt that if he will make an offer of intervention for peace, that before anyone in England can oppose it, the Duke of Windsor will instantly issue a statement supporting it, and that will start a revolution in England and force peace. Which is just, okay, first of all, who does the Duke think that he is? Why would anybody do anything as massive as say, our country's not going to get involved in this war because I want the endorsement of this joker? Who cares what David thinks? David can't run his own life. So I don't need his stamp of approval on this. No, thank you. Well, it didn't really matter anyway, because 3 days later, Arsler went to go see Roosevelt, who was a friend of his. He can go and bear this message. Arsler, who was an isolationist, approved the message, but he was shocked to discover that agents of the colonial secretary had been listening to what the Duke had said and to what Drury had said to me, and that this report had been sent to the British embassy, and the embassy had sent it to Roosevelt. Roosevelt knew exactly what I had come to tell him before I opened my mouth. So the Duke's friendship with Winogrand was causing increasing alarm in both the British and American official circles, and Churchill's private secretary wrote to Christopher Eastwood that Mr. Hopkins mentioned the deplorable effect which the Duke's recent cruise with Miss Winogrand had in America. And basically, the Americans were appalled that the Duke would have anything to do with anyone who was so clearly pro-Nazi. And I mean, everybody knew this about Winogrand, despite what he may have tried to claim. It was well established and well accepted that he wanted to support the Germans at any cost. And that they did not want anyone to believe that Winogrand had any friendship with any members of the United States administration, because if he tried to say that was true, it was categorically false. And it was their disdain of him that led to their mistrust of the Duke. Winogrand was considered by the Americans to be a dangerous pro-Nazi, and all of his activities were closely watched. So it was with this knowledge that the Duke was warned by the colonial secretary to keep his distance from Göring's pal. And he was shown an MI6 report produced in November 1939 by Sir Charles Dunnes, the previous governor himself, warned of Winogrand's activities. The feeling was that David wouldn't be necessarily very impressed by any of this. Clearly, he had been told previously who Winogrand was, but it was like, well, just tell him again. Just tell him again, because he can never come back at us and say, no one told me. We have to absolve ourselves of any guilt that this relationship might cause. If we've told him who this guy is, we've done our due diligence. What more can we do? The Duke refused to believe his officials, replying, "He's a very prominent and important resident of the Bahamas, engaged in various development schemes most beneficial to this colony, and giving vast amount of employment. I regard him as deserving of all possible encouragement." Oh, how noble of you, David, just wanting to give jobs to the locals. Pitter-patter goes my heart. Oh, I love you so much, David, for caring so much about the everyman. Please. The Colonial Office began to accumulate files on Winogrand and his plans, one entitled Development and Winogrand, Bahamas, 1941, and suggested that there were considerable misgivings about Mr. W.'s attachment to our cause, and indeed some hints that he may sub rosa be engaged in acts of economic warfare directed against the Allied cause. And of course, they were keeping Buckingham Palace apprised of everything that was going on with the Duke, letting the king know that David had these close associations. One report said that Lord Lloyd thought that the king might care to have for information the attached note, which surmises what we know about Mr. Axel Winogrand. The report is, of course, derived from the most secret sources. You know, I can understand why the king needed to have that information, but the fact that they keep coming to the Duke saying, hey, by the way, did you know your pal is X, Y, and Z, seems to me ill-placed advice. First of all, David doesn't care. But second of all, David's going to run right over to Axel Winogrand and be like, hey, did you know what those guys are saying about you? You know, and he's going to run down the gamut of, then they told me this, and they told me this, and they told me that. Why are they letting David know anything? You know, he doesn't care. They've told him their doubts about Axel since the minute he set foot with that guy, way back in 1937. But he doesn't care now in 1941. He's still over here rubbing elbows and being like, we're great pals. He wants to help the island. The information that they gave the king ran this way. It said that Winogrand had been in favor of a compromised peace on the basis that a strong Germany is necessary as part of a united front against Bolshevism. At the same time, some sources have stated that he had shown definitely pro-German sympathies, and it was also reported that he had arranged shipments of oil in Germany in the early part of the year. And they found that he is sponsoring an opposition movement in America for the overthrow of the present Swedish government in favor of a national socialist government, which would collaborate closely with Germany. There's, you know, enough of this already. I'm just even annoyed with it. Like, could he possibly be working against us? Like, we need to keep an eye on him. We think he might be pro-Germany. How could he not be? He's over here orchestrating arrangements of oil to Germany in the early part of the year. Helping the enemy means he is the enemy. You know, like, enough already of this. Now, it's strongly believed, some would surmise. No, he is. He is as good as a Nazi. The State Department memo now drew attention to the fact that both Winogrand and the Duke were seeing a great deal of prominent and influential American businessmen, particularly from the Midwestern states, where a strictly commercial point of view would appear to prevail in business circles with regard to relations between the United States and Germany. Winogrand and the Duke of Windsor stressed the need for a negotiating peace at this time on account of the advantages which this would present to American business interests. And of course, those in authority felt this angle should be closely observed. This is all very messed up, but I also am annoyed by any businessman who could so easily be manipulated with a dollar sign. You've got to consider peace. Think of the economic advantage, says the Duke. Well, he considers the throne that he abdicated and the queen who he wants sitting by his side. So he's over here manipulating everybody. But, at a certain point, it's your own fault if you choose to be manipulated by such a sorry excuse. People continue to suggest that somebody should say something privately to the Duke of Windsor. Somebody's got to pull that guy aside. We've got to let him know who he's involved with. But you know what I said is that everyone is already pulling him aside, having a quiet word with him, and he doesn't care. And at a certain point, you just have to stop giving this grown man the handout and the hand up. Because everybody is bent over backwards trying to help this person navigate through life in a successful manner. Oh, keep him away from this person. Lady so-and-so, can you make sure they don't eat with that person? Oh, let's remember to have a quiet word. Let's send a telegram. Let's go put him all the way in the Bahamas so that he can't hurt anybody or hurt himself. It's like, when are we just going to let this guy crash and burn and hang himself with so much rope that he has? Because this person needs to stop being helped. Stop giving him money. Stop giving it. You know how you help this guy? By not giving him another cent. By not giving him one more appointment that he asks for. By giving him nothing. Because the problem is, it's not like, I wonder if David has Nazi sympathies. The whole family could have sat around and had that conversation. And if even one of them came out of that conversation and being like, I still trust David, then they are liars. They are lying to themselves about what David was really and truly up to. You can see who he's friends with. You can see that he went to Germany and visited Hitler. You know that. You know he's now big buddies with Axel Wennergren, who you know is a Nazi. His wife and von Ribbentrop were joined at the hip for years. So for anybody in England to have ever been like, well, let's still try to help him out. Please, enough of this already. I'm so tired of everybody trying to help him. And the fact that they would even be roping in old lady William Taylor's and being like, now what your job here is, the piece of the puzzle that you're going to play. Leave that poor lady alone. Everybody is toiling relentlessly for this man who won't even toil for himself. So concerned were the British about this relationship that they started to ask their American counterparts to maybe say something to David. Like, could one of you, like, he's not listening to us. Could one of you have a little word with David about who he's actually with? Like, it's not just our idea that Axel is a dangerous person. Like, let him know that your intelligence says the same thing. But David didn't care. It didn't matter who had the conversation with him. American, British, David was out. He didn't care. Didn't matter to him. The problem now, too, wasn't just the fact that he was embedded in a relationship with Axel Wennergren, but now Axel was introducing him to other problematic people. One person that came into the picture was the brother of the new Mexican president. And this guy was problematic because the British government had already broken diplomatic relationships with the Mexican government in 1938 over the expropriation of British oil properties. And yet the Duke is over here being buddy-buddy with this guy because he's Axel's friend. And the Duke, as a representative of the British government, should not have met with him at all, but as a favor to Wennergren, he entertained the Mexican for 2 hours at the government house. The meeting, which also involved a scheme to circumvent foreign exchange rules by sending monies to Mexico City, was reported to the authorities by Montgomery Hyde, who was an MI officer who just happened to be there at the house. He was doing a security audit of Government House. And it was revealed that one of those in the 16-member Mexican delegation was on an FBI blacklist. But what care did David have, He's throwing a dinner party, And it's all as a favor to Axel. So if Axel wants to bring into his house people that his government wouldn't even want him being with, and, allowing this guy into his home who's on an FBI blacklist, whatever, just throwing the doors open to anybody because it makes him feel good that important people want to talk to him. The British intelligence report about Axel Wennergren ran with as many details as we've already heard, so I won't belabor that particular report. But at the very end of it, it does say that Wennergren is also said to be attempting to form in America a cartel to control the wood trade. It is known that the United States authorities suspect Wennergren of being in close touch with Nazi leaders. So he's just got his hand in all sorts of things. He is over there making deals with the Mexican government and any oil and minerals that they have at their disposal that he's trying to get over to Germany. And then he's over here in America trying to get having create a cartel to control the wood trade. I mean, my goodness gracious, is anybody going to stop this Swede? He's just over here with his hands in everything. A further concern was the simultaneous arrival in the Bahamas of Alfred P. Sloan, the head of General Motors, and his colleague James D. Mooney. Now, the plot thickens with the American traders coming into the picture because Mr. Edward Winter, formerly General Motors distributor in Berlin, and at present this company's representative in Paris, acted as a courier in delivering communications from Mr. James Mooney, who is again president of the General Motors Overseas Corporation, to high German officials in Paris. Mr. Winter had a special report which enabled him to travel freely between occupied and unoccupied France. Mr. Mooney was known to be in sympathy with the German government, and the persons who supplied this information believed that the General Motors official was transmitting information of a confidential nature through Mr. Winter. The shocking thing here, I mean, that's already shocking enough, but it gets far worse. But to give a little bit more color to Mooney's activities with Hitler, since Hitler had come to power in 1933, General Motors had invested over $100 million in Germany, money that had been diverted from car to tank production. And Sloan argued that an international business operating throughout the world should conduct its operations in strictly business terms without regard to the political beliefs of its management or the political beliefs of the country in which it's operating. What an immoral simplification. It's totally ridiculous to say, oh, I'm going to invest money in that country, and it's really none of my business that they're killing people and gassing people because of their ethnicity. I mean, I know, we invested $100 million for car production, and now they're using it as tanks to roll over innocent people. But I mean, what business is that of mine? They paid me. I'm making money off of it, so I'm not really sure why that should be my concern. I can't care about everything. Okay, well, enjoy hell. On March 4th, George Messersmith, now the U.S. ambassador in Cuba, filed a report on Mooney describing him as mad as any Nazi and one of those who nourishes the hope that when the United States may turn fascist, he will be our Quisling or our Label. Now, the last point of our chapter has to do with the article that came out that David had given to Liberty Magazine, the one that he spent 2 hours talking about all of his thoughts and ideas that he should have kept as quiet as possible. In March, the interview given the previous December appeared in Liberty. And the Duke, which we all knew was a Judas Iscariot from the get-go, has just proven what sort of stuff he's made up in this interview. He says, America will help Britain more by not engaging in actual fighting, but remain a keystone for the new world, which must be created when the war is over. There will be a new order in Europe, whether imposed by Germany or Britain. Goebbels noted in his diary after reading this interview, the Duke of Windsor has given an interview in a magazine in the USA in which he pretty frankly declaims all chance of a British victory. We decide not to use it for the present so as to avoid suffocating this tender seedling of reason. Good grief. I mean, can you even imagine how delighted they were when that interview came out? Valentine Vivian, the deputy head of MI6, immediately briefed Kenneth Robinson in the Colonial Office how it infuriates heads of news services who have seen advance copy. Article contains useful ammunition for appeasement group. The article was discussed with the head of MI6, but it was decided that it was too late to act. I mean, what are they going to do now? It's already out, But it is annoying because it might have been stopped. People knew that it was known that this article was going to run, and it went out anyway. Churchill, who had been passed a press summary and had also briefed the palace, immediately sent a telegram to the Duke marked personal and secret. It read, "Exception is taken also in the United States to your Royal Highness's interview recently published in Liberty, of which it is said that the language, whatever was meant, will certainly be interpreted as defeatist and pro-Nazi, and by implication approving of the isolationist aim to keep America out of the war. I must say, it seems to me that the views attributed to your Royal Highness have been unfortunately expressed by the journalist. I would wish indeed that your Royal Highness would seek advice before making public statement of this kind. I should always be ready to help as I used to in the past." And of course, the Duke comes back with this pathetic explanation for himself. He had seen and approved the article before publication, but now he attempted to distance himself from it, claiming to Lord Moynie, the colonial secretary, that many views and opinions expressed in the Liberty article were words that were put into my mouth, as is so often the case in American journalism. I didn't say any of those things. They just made it seem like that's what I said. They were put into my mouth, those scoundrel Americans. Then, as an attack to Churchill, he didn't try that take with Churchill, but instead he said this: "The importance you attach to American magazine articles prompts me to tell you that I strongly resent and take great exception to the article in the magazine Life of the 17th March entitled The Queen, in which the latter is quoted as referring to the Duchess as that woman. I understand that articles about the royal family are censored in Britain before release, and this remark is a direct insult to my wife, and is, I can assure you, no encouragement in our efforts to uphold the monarchical system in a British colony." That is the worst comeback of all time. Like, hey man, you really screwed us when you decided to do that interview with Liberty Magazine. You know, maybe talk to me first before you decide to say that we're going to lose and that there's no hope and that Germany's going to take over. Maybe don't say that. You know, it kind of looks bad. And he's like, oh yeah, well, you know what? One time in a magazine, somebody called my wife that woman. So, there. It's like, all right, well, what's that got to do with the fact that you are a traitor on 1,000 different levels? Sorry somebody called your wife a name. It must sting, but, you know, we're trying to save the world over here. So he ended his letter with this manipulative but also meaningless statement: "I have both valued and enjoyed our friendship in the past, but after your telegram of the 1st July and the tone of your recent messages to me here, I find it difficult to believe that you are still the friend that you used to be. So, you're not invited to my birthday party." And Churchill, who had more important priorities, did not even answer. Good for him. Well, that's the end of that chapter. This was a long episode. I'm sorry about the banging and whatnot upstairs. You know, this is a cheap rental, and the children running around upstairs makes a lot of noise. So my apologies, but also my thanks to you for just sticking with it. Anyway, I will see you later this week. Have a good one. Bye.